There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by routine until they are upon you, holding a significance you were not prepared for. They are the quiet hinges on which the future turns. For me, that moment smelled of lavender-scented laundry detergent and the faint, clean scent of rain on concrete, all of it underscored by the warm, living weight of Julian's head in my lap. He was asleep, utterly boneless and surrendered to a depth of exhaustion that seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. His breathing was a slow, even tide against the fabric of my jeans, a sound so profoundly intimate in the stillness of my apartment that it felt like a confession. My own breath was a thing I had to manually operate, a conscious command to my lungs. In, out, do not betray yourself. Do not let the frantic hammering in your chest disturb this fragile truce. This was not part of the ritual we had wordlessly established. The ritual involved movies we barely watched, takeout containers scattered on the coffee table, and the slow, creeping fatigue that would eventually claim him. Usually, he would succumb on the far end of the couch, a respectable demilitarized zone of worn cushions between us. He would fold into himself, a man accustomed to taking up space, suddenly making himself small. I would watch him from the corner of my eye, my focus split between the flickering screen and the subtle narrative of his descent into sleep. I'd learned the signs, the way his blinks would lengthen, the slow slump of his shoulders, the eventual surrender as his chin dipped to his chest. Once he was fully under, I would drape a blanket over him, my movements practiced and silent, the gesture of a caretaker, a friend. A very, very careful friend. But tonight was different. Tonight, without preamble or permission, he had simply shifted, rolling onto his side and settling his head into my lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if it were a place he had been returning to his entire life. My hand was frozen on the armrest, a useless appendage. I wanted to touch his hair. The desire was a physical ache, a sharp, specific longing that started in my fingertips and radiated up my arm, lodging itself behind my sternum. His hair, which always looked artfully disheveled, was a dark mess against the faded denim of my legs. Strands of it caught the low, golden light from the lamp in the corner, turning from near black to threads of bronze. I could map the constellations of my own yearning in those illuminated strands. To touch him felt like it would be a transgression of the highest order, a violation of the unspoken treaty that had governed our friendship for a decade. And yet, his presence there, so trusting and so vulnerable, felt like an invitation. It was a paradox that left me paralyzed, caught between the instinct to protect him and the desperate need to claim this impossible closeness for myself. The air in the room felt thick, charged with all the things I had never said, all the feelings I had meticulously cataloged and filed away in the locked archives of my heart. His sleep was a deep, silent ocean, and I was a man standing on the shore, terrified of the undertow, yet mesmerized by the pull of the tide. Looking back, I can see that our story was never one of grand, cinematic declarations. It was a narrative written in the margins, in the subtext of shared silences and gestures that hovered in the ambiguous space between friendship and something more. It was a story about doors left slightly ajar, about the geography of a couch, about the silent language of proximity. We met in a university library, a cavernous hall of books that always smelled of dust and decaying paper and the faint, anxious sweat of impending exams. I was a ghost in that place, a quiet observer tucked into a remote corral, surrounded by monographs on the history of photography. I lived in a world of silver halides and developing chemicals, of light and shadow, of capturing moments that were already gone. My life was about framing the world, containing it in a neat rectangle, imposing order on its chaos. And then there was Julian. He was not a ghost. He was a comet, a blaze of kinetic energy that seemed entirely at odds with the hallowed silence of the library. He was the star forward of the university's soccer team, a creature of motion and muscle and effortless charisma. His laughter, when he forgot to suppress it, would echo down the long aisles of shelves. earning him a chorus of shushing and the librarian's iciest glare. I knew who he was, of course. Everyone did. He moved through campus with an easy, unself-conscious grace, perpetually surrounded by a rotating cast of friends and admirers. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets caught in his orbit. I was a very distant planet, a frozen rock on the outer edge of the solar system, content to observe his light from a safe and lonely distance. Our unlikely intersection came courtesy of a shared elective, the architecture of power, a class neither of us should have been in. I was there because the professor was a known easy grader and I needed to pad my GPA. He was there, as I later learned, because his academic advisor had told him it would look good on his transcript. We were seated 2 rows apart. I noticed him on the first day, of course. It was impossible not to. He was restless, constantly shifting in his seat, tapping a pen against his notebook, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy that seemed to be searching for an outlet, for a field to run on. I was a specialist in noticing things. My camera had trained my eye to find the telling detail, the subtle crack in the facade, the moment of vulnerability that reveals the truth. I saw that beneath the athletic confidence, there was a current of anxiety in him that I recognized. We didn't speak for the first month. We were simply 2 bodies occupying the same lecture hall twice a week. Then came the midterm paper. It was a monstrous assignment, requiring a level of research that sent the entire class into a panic. The library, once a place of quiet contemplation, became a frantic hive of activity. And one night, around 2 in the morning, fueled by stale coffee and desperation, he appeared at my corral. He looked lost. The usual confidence was gone, replaced by a sheepish exhaustion. He was holding a stack of books that seemed to be on the verge of toppling over. "Hey," he said, his voice a low rumble that was startlingly close. "You're Leo, right? From the architecture class?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. I had been studying the contact sheets from a recent shoot, images of abandoned buildings on the edge of town. His presence felt like a floodlight suddenly switched on in my darkroom. "I have no idea what I'm doing," he confessed, gesturing with his chin toward the books. "I've read the same page 6 times, and I think I'm getting dumber." "You always seem like you know what's going on." It was such a simple, direct admission of vulnerability. It disarmed me completely. I looked at him, at the dark circles under his eyes and the way a stray lock of hair fell across his forehead, and I saw not the campus celebrity, but just a guy who was in over his head. Some part of me, the part that always wanted to fix things, to bring them into focus, stirred to life. "The trick is not to read everything," I said, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "It's to find the one good argument in each book and string them together." He gave me a tired, grateful smile that lit up his whole face. It was a devastatingly effective weapon. "Could you maybe show me?" And so began our friendship. We spent the next week huddled in my corral, building his paper sentence by sentence. I learned that he wasn't unintelligent. His mind just worked differently. It was quick, associative, always leaping ahead. He needed someone to anchor him, to help him structure the torrent of ideas. I was that anchor. In return, he brought me coffee. He told me stories about his team, about the absurd pressure of collegiate sports, about the secret relief he felt when he was injured for a few weeks because it meant he could just be a student. He was funny and self-deprecating and surprisingly insightful. He treated me not as a tutor, but as a peer, an equal. For the first time, I felt seen by someone who wasn't looking at me through a viewfinder. The moment I knew my feelings had metastasized into something unmanageable, something dangerous, came a few months later. It was the conference championship game. He had insisted I come. "You have to," he'd said, grabbing my arm with an easy familiarity that made my skin tingle. "You're my good luck charm. I wrote my best paper with you." I went, feeling conspicuous and out of place among the cheering crowds. I stood at the back, my camera bag slung over my shoulder, feeling more like an anthropologist than a spectator. The game went into overtime. It was tense, brutal. And then, in the final minute, Julian scored. It was a beautiful, impossible goal, a long shot from outside the box that sailed into the top corner of the net. The stadium erupted. His teammates mobbed him, a pile of joyous, exhausted bodies. But my focus was solely on him. After he emerged from the pile-up, he stood alone for a second, his hands on his head, his face turned up to the sky, and he was just beaming. It wasn't a smile for the crowd or the cameras. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated, incandescent joy. A look of such profound relief and happiness that it took my breath away. In that instant, watching him from 100 feet away, I understood. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart crumbled to dust. The quiet, manageable affection I felt for my friend had become a vast, terrifying, and unconditional love. I lifted my camera, almost by instinct, and took a single photograph. It was blurry, shot from too far away, technically a failure. But I kept it. It was the most honest picture I had ever taken. It was the proof of my own undoing. After college, our lives diverged in predictable ways. He was headhunted by a top-tier consulting firm, trading his cleats for bespoke suits and his soccer field for a series of identical, anonymous boardrooms across the country. His life became a blur of airports, rental cars, and PowerPoint presentations. I stayed in the city, building a precarious career as a freelance photographer. I traded the certainty of a salary for the freedom to chase the light, to find beauty in forgotten corners and overlooked details. Our friendship should have faded. It's what friendships from college usually do. They become fond memories, punctuated by the occasional holiday text or a like on a social media post. But ours didn't. Somehow it deepened. We were the fixed points in each other's increasingly chaotic lives. My small, quiet apartment became his sanctuary, the one place he didn't have to perform. He would call me from a hotel room in Des Moines or a taxi in Atlanta, not to talk about anything important, but just to hear a familiar voice, to be reminded of a world that existed outside of profit margins and stakeholder meetings. And I, in turn, found a strange comfort in his relentless forward motion. He was my connection to a world of ambition and structure that I had consciously rejected, but was still fascinated by. He'd bring the world to my doorstep, and I'd offer him a refuge from it. He dated, of course. There was a succession of bright, accomplished women. There was Jessica, the lawyer, then Chloe, the marketing executive, and finally, Amelia, the architect. They were all lovely, and they all, in their own way, misunderstood him. They saw the charm, the success, the easy confidence. They didn't see the boy in the library, lost and overwhelmed. They didn't know about the anxiety that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. I was polite to all of them. I was the supportive best friend, the one who listened to Julian's relationship woes, who offered neutral, carefully worded advice. Each new girlfriend was a fresh wave of a familiar, low-grade ache. It was the price of admission for staying in his life. I paid it without complaint. I learned to be a master of compartmentalization. There was Leo, the friend. And then there was the other Leo, the one who lived in a secret, locked room inside my own chest. The one who held the blurry photograph of a boy celebrating a goal. The two never met. Amelia was the most serious. They were together for almost 3 years. They moved in together. They spoke of the future in vague, aspirational terms. I watched it all from my usual, safe distance. I helped them move a couch into their new apartment. I went to their housewarming party and took pictures of them, a happy, beautiful couple, and I felt a pang so sharp it was almost a physical blow. But I smiled, and I calibrated my camera, and I framed the shot perfectly. I was good at framing things. I was good at creating the illusion of a perfect picture, even when I knew about the cracks just outside the edges. I had convinced myself that this was enough, that having him in my life as a friend was a gift I should be grateful for, and that wanting more was a form of greed, a selfishness I had to suppress. I was a patient man. I knew how to wait. I had spent my entire life waiting for the right light, for the right moment. I told myself I was just waiting for this feeling to pass. But it never did. It just learned to live more quietly. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding tectonic movement that had been building pressure for months. It began with the end of Julian and Amelia. The breakup was her decision. I got the news in a text from him, 3 words that felt both momentous and strangely flat. Amelia left me. There was no follow-up, no explanation. Just that stark, unadorned fact. I waited, my phone heavy in my hand, but nothing else came. I didn't know what to do. The best friend protocol manual had chapters on breakups that involved ice cream and bad movies and long, cathartic rants. It had no instructions for this kind of silence. 2 days later, he showed up at my door. It was late, past midnight. He didn't knock. He used the key I had given him years ago, the one he was only supposed to use in an emergency. I was in my darkroom, a small, windowless bathroom I had converted, trying to coax an image out of a sheet of photographic paper. The click of the lock was an alien sound in the deep, red-lit silence. My heart leaped into my throat. I imagined fire, a break-in, 100 different disasters. I threw open the door, blinking in the sudden brightness of the hallway. He was just standing there, in the middle of my living room, still wearing his work suit, though the tie was loosened and the top button of his shirt was undone. His travel bag was slumped by his feet. He looked vacant. Not sad, not angry. Just empty. Like a house with all the furniture removed. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy. "Jules," I breathed, relief and a wave of concern washing over me. "Are you okay? I got your text." I was so worried, he shrugged, a gesture that seemed to take an immense amount of effort. "She said I was a ghost," he said, not looking at me, but at a spot on the wall somewhere over my shoulder. "She said I was here, but not here. That I was emotionally unavailable." He recited the words like he was reading from a performance review, a list of his own failings. "She's not wrong," he didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just seemed to deflate, right there in my living room. He sank onto my couch, the one he would later claim as his emotional infirmary, and stared into space. I didn't know what to say. All the comforting platitudes felt like lies. So I said nothing. I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass of water. I put it on the coffee table in front of him. He didn't touch it. I sat down in the armchair opposite him, keeping a careful distance, and I just waited. We sat there for an hour in a silence that was heavier than any conversation. Eventually, his eyes drooped, and his head lolled to the side. He had flown in from Chicago that evening, straight from a week of grueling meetings into the wreckage of his personal life. The exhaustion was absolute. "You should sleep," I said softly. He nodded, not opening his eyes. "Can I?" he started, his voice thick with sleep. "Can I just stay here tonight? On the couch?" "Of course, Jules. Stay as long as you need." That night was the beginning. He didn't go back to the apartment he had shared with Amelia. He couldn't bear the echo of her absence, he said. He stayed on my couch for a week, living out of his travel bag, wearing the wrinkled suits he'd been living in for days. I'd come home from a shoot to find him asleep in the exact same position I'd left him in, the television murmuring to an empty room. He was a ship that had lost its rudder, and my small apartment had become his accidental, quiet harbor. He was seeking refuge, and I, the long-suffering keeper of the lighthouse, would not, turn him away. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. It was a comforting lie, a necessary fiction to keep my own hope from becoming a tidal wave that would sweep us both away. And so the ritual was born, not from a plan, but from an accretion of desperate moments. After that first week, he found a new apartment, a sterile, furnished place that felt more like a hotel suite than a home. But the pattern was set. My apartment was his anchor. Every Friday, after a week of battling corporate dragons in faraway cities, he would appear at my door. The pretext was always casual. "Want to get takeout?" Or "anything good on TV?" But we both knew what it really was. It was his time to decompress, to shed the armor he wore for the rest of the world. He needed the quiet. He needed the absence of expectation. He needed me, in a way he couldn't articulate and I couldn't acknowledge. The first few times, the geography of the couch was strictly maintained. He would take one end, I the other. The remote control and a bowl of popcorn would occupy the neutral territory between us. We would talk, or not. Sometimes he would vent about his work, the endless pressure, the soul-crushing pointlessness of it all. Other times, we would sit in a comfortable silence, the only sound the low thrum of the city outside my window. And inevitably, sleep would take him. I became a connoisseur of his exhaustion. I could see it in the sag of his shoulders, the dullness in his eyes, the way his movements became slow and deliberate. Then came the night he crossed the first border. We were watching some forgettable action movie, the kind with lots of explosions and very little plot. He had been quieter than usual all evening. His responses monosyllabic. Halfway through the film, he shifted, stretched, and then, without a word, he lay down, turning his back to me and curling into a ball at his end of the sofa. My entire body went rigid. It was such a small change, but it felt monumental. It was an admission of a need for comfort that went beyond the verbal. He was treating my home, my space, like his own, like a safe place. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. After a few minutes, his breathing deepened into the slow, steady cadence of sleep. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move, gently draping the throw blanket over his shoulders. My fingers brushed against the fabric of his shirt, and the jolt was so intense I had to snatch my hand back as if I'd been burned. The next Friday, he did it again. This time, it was less hesitant. The movie started, and within 20 minutes, he had settled into his sleeping position. It was becoming a part of the routine, a silent, agreed-upon script. And then, a few weeks later, came the escalation that left me breathless. It was the night of the lavender detergent and the rain-slicked streets. He had arrived looking shattered, a pale, drawn version of himself. He'd lost a major client, he told me, his voice flat with defeat. We ordered pizza, which he barely touched. We put on a movie, which I don't think he even registered. He was just staring at the screen, his gaze a million miles away. Then he blinked slowly, as if coming back to himself from a great distance. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with a sorrow so deep it made my own chest ache in sympathy. He didn't say anything. He just moved. He slid across the cushions, a slow, deliberate migration, and laid his head in my lap. Time stopped. The movie, the city, the world, it all faded away, leaving only the stunning, terrifying reality of his presence. His hair was soft against my leg. I could feel the warmth of him through the denim. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My mind was a riot of conflicting impulses. Push him away. This is a line. This is a mistake. Don't push him away. Don't move. Don't breathe. This is all you've ever wanted. I did nothing. I became a statue, a monument to indecision. He sighed, a soft, weary sound, and his body relaxed completely, a final act of surrender. He trusted me. He trusted me this much. The thought was both a balm and a torment. He was seeking comfort from a friend. He was finding solace in a place he believed to be safe. He had no idea that he was asleep in the arms of a man who loved him, that his safe harbor was, in fact, the epicenter of a hurricane. That night, I did not sleep. I sat there for hours, long after the movie had ended and the screen had gone black, my legs cramping, my back aching. I just watched him sleep. I studied the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the slight parting of his lips, the absolute peace that had settled on his features. It was a kind of beautiful agony. I felt like a thief, stealing a moment of intimacy that wasn't meant for me. In the dim light, he looked younger, more vulnerable, the confident mask of the consultant stripped away to reveal the boy I had met in the library all those years ago. And a fierce, protective feeling rose in me, so powerful it almost choked me. I wanted to build a fortress around that moment, to keep the harsh light of morning from ever reaching it. This became the new ritual, the unspoken, terrifying, wonderful new ritual. Fridays were movie nights, and movie nights meant Julian would end up with his head in my lap. Sometimes he would murmur an excuse, something about a headache or a stiff neck, a flimsy piece of plausible deniability for us both to cling to. I would accept the excuse with a nod, my own silent complicity in the charade. We never spoke of it. The next morning, he would be up before me, already dressed, the blankets folded neatly on the couch, as if to erase the evidence. We would have coffee, talk about the weather or my latest project, and he would leave. The line had been crossed so many times it had been worn away, yet we both pretended it was still there, a solid, unbreachable wall. The tension was beginning to fray my nerves. I lived for Fridays, and I dreaded them. The anticipation was a drug, and the anxiety was its crippling side effect. My photography suffered. I couldn't focus. The world outside my apartment seemed gray and muted. All the color, all the light, was concentrated in those few hours on my couch. I started to wonder if I was imagining things, if I was projecting my own desires onto his simple, platonic need for comfort. Was I just a convenient pillow? A human-weighted blanket? The thought was humiliating. But then I would remember the way he sought me out, the complete trust in his surrender, and the hope that stubborn, resilient weed would grow back. The ritual escalated again on a cold night in November. A storm was raging outside, a furious assault of wind and rain against my window panes. Julian was supposed to be in Boston, but his flight had been canceled. He called me from the airport. "Everything's grounded," he said, his voice tinny over the phone, background noise of chaotic airport announcements. "I'm stuck. You can take a train," I suggested. A pause. "Leo," he said, and my name sounded so weary. I don't think I can. I'm so tired. Can I just come over?" An hour later, he was at my door, soaked and shivering, his suit plastered to his frame. I took his wet coat, made him a cup of tea, and ordered him to take a hot shower. I gave him a pair of my sweatpants and a soft, worn t-shirt. They were too short on him, the sweatpants ending a few inches above his ankles, but he didn't seem to care. He looked small and lost in my clothes. After his shower, the exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. He didn't even make it to the couch. He just stood in the middle of the living room, swaying slightly. "I can't even make it home," he mumbled, his eyes glassy. "I'm sorry to do this to you. Don't be an idiot," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You're staying here. You can take the bed. I'll sleep on the couch." He shook his head, a slow, stubborn refusal. "No, it's your bed. I'm the guest. The couch is fine." We went back and forth for a few minutes, a ridiculous, whispered argument between two exhausted men. I was insistent. He was just as stubborn. Finally, he looked at my queen-sized bed, then back at me, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. It's big enough," he said, the words barely audible over the storm. "Isn't it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken implications. It was not a question about the dimensions of my mattress. It was a question about boundaries, about the space between us, about a line we were both staring at, wondering who would dare to cross it first. My heart was a trapped bird beating against my ribs. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "It's big enough," and so we shared my bed. It felt like a sacred space, a stage set for a play whose script I didn't know. I gave him a t-shirt to sleep in and climbed in on the far left side, my back to him, my body rigid. He got in on the other side, equally cautious. The space between us was a vast, cold chasm. I could feel the mattress dip with his weight, could sense his presence behind me like a source of heat. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the sound of his breathing and the rain against the glass. This was a new level of agony. To be so close, yet so far. To share a bed with the man I loved and pretend we were just two friends escaping a storm. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because I woke up in the dead of night to a profound change. The chasm was gone. In his sleep, he had migrated across the mattress. He had turned toward me, and his arm was draped loosely over my waist. His face was buried in my shoulder blade, his breath warm against my back. I went completely still, every muscle in my body locking up. This was not the couch. This was not his head in my lap. This was different. This was my bed, my most private space, and he was holding me. Asleep, yes. Unconscious, yes. But the physical reality of it was overwhelming. I lay there for what felt like hours, caught in a state of suspended animation. I analyzed the weight of his arm, the rhythm of his breathing, the slight shifts in his body as he dreamt. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. Part of me wanted to pull away, to restore the safe distance, to protect myself from the inevitable morning after awkwardness. But a much larger part of me, the part that had been starving for a decade, wanted to sink into it, to turn over and wrap my own arms around him, to finally close the gap. I did neither. I just lay there, his unwitting anchor in the dark, and I let him hold me. This, too, became part of the ritual. Not every Friday, but often enough. The excuse was always there. He was too tired to drive home. It was too late. It was easier this way. We would start on opposite sides of the bed, two separate islands. And sometime in the night, the tectonic plates of our lonely continents would shift, and he would drift toward me, seeking warmth, seeking contact. I never knew if he was aware of it. In the morning, he would be back on his side, the space between us restored, the evidence of our nocturnal collision erased. We never spoke of it. We just let the silence grow, pregnant with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. I felt like I was living in a photograph that was perpetually underexposed, a world of shadows and faint outlines, waiting for the flash that would either reveal everything or plunge us into total darkness. The flash came on a Tuesday night in early spring. It was unusual for him to be at my place on a weeknight, but he had a rare, glorious week with no travel. He'd been almost giddy with the freedom of it, the novelty of sleeping in the same time zone for more than 2 nights in a row. We had made dinner together, a messy, chaotic affair that involved more laughing than cooking. The easy camaraderie of our early friendship was back, unburdened by the usual Friday night exhaustion. It felt normal, dangerously normal. We ended up in bed, not out of fatigue, but just because it was where the evening led. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, talking. We talked about our futures. I talked about a potential gallery show, a series I was working on about the architecture of memory. He talked about his growing disillusionment with his job, the gnawing feeling that he was building nothing, creating nothing, just moving money around. Sometimes I think I should have been a carpenter, he said quietly into the darkness. Or a stonemason. Something real. Something you can touch. The conversation eventually wound down, replaced by a comfortable silence. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I thought he had fallen asleep. But then, in the stillness, his voice came, so soft it was almost part of the silence itself. Leo. I turned my head on the pillow. Yeah. He didn't turn. He just kept staring at the ceiling. A long, stretched-out moment passed, so long I thought maybe I had imagined him speaking. Are you awake? He asked. A nervous bubble of laughter escaped me, small and tight. I am now another silence. This one was different. It wasn't comfortable. It was charged, electric. I could feel him gathering his courage, wrestling with a thought. I held my breath. He finally turned his head to look at me. In the dim, gray light, his eyes were dark pools of uncertainty. He looked scared. Would it be weird, he began, his voice a fragile whisper, if I kissed you? The world stopped. My lungs forgot their function. My heart, that frantic bird, ceased its beating. The question was not a proposition. It was a plea. It was the terrified, vulnerable core of him laid bare in the darkness of my bedroom. He was asking for permission, not just to kiss me, but to cross a line from which there was no return. He was asking me to share the risk, to take his hand and jump with him into the terrifying, unknown abyss. I couldn't find my voice. The words were tangled in my throat, a knot of shock and hope in a decade of repressed longing. So I answered him with the only language that felt true. I turned my body toward him, a slow, deliberate movement. I moved until we were face to face, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. I looked into his eyes, searching for a hint of a joke, a sign of a mistake, but all I saw was a raw, trembling sincerity. And I gave a single, tiny nod. It was barely a movement at all, more of a release of tension than a conscious gesture. But it was enough. He saw it. He understood. He leaned in slowly, giving me every possible chance to pull away, to stop him, to retreat to the safety of our friendship. I didn't move. I stayed right there, meeting him halfway. His lips touched mine. It was not a kiss of passion or of frantic desire. It was a question. It was tentative, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was the kiss of a man who was lost and was hoping to be found. It tasted of salt and fear and a profound, aching tenderness. My own lips were clumsy, unpracticed in this new language. but I kissed him back. I answered his question with a quiet affirmation of my own. It lasted only a few seconds, but it contained the entire history of us. It was the period at the end of a long, unspoken sentence. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. Our foreheads rested together, our breath mingling in the small space between us. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. It was a moment that existed outside of language, in the realm of pure, terrifying, beautiful feeling. In the darkness, I finally let my hand do what it had longed to do for years. I reached up and gently threaded my fingers into his hair. He didn't flinch. He leaned into my touch, a small, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. It was a sound of relief. It was the sound of a man coming home. The aftermath was a brutal, cold dawn. I woke to the feeling of an empty bed. The space beside me was cool to the touch, the indentation of his body already fading. For a disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamt it all. The whispered question, the hesitant kiss, the feeling of his hair beneath my fingers. But then I saw it. A coffee mug, full and untouched, on my bedside table. A peace offering. Or a guilt offering. I found him in the living room. He was already fully dressed in yesterday's clothes, which were now rumpled and sad. He was staring out the window, his shoulders tense, his back a rigid wall. He was a stranger in my apartment. The easy intimacy of the night before had evaporated, leaving this cold, awkward fog in its place. "Jules," I said, my voice thick with sleep and apprehension. He flinched, startled by the sound. He turned, but he couldn't meet my eyes. His gaze darted around the room, landing on the couch, the bookshelf, the floor, anywhere but on my face. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. I have to go. Early meeting. I didn't want to wake you, it was a lie. A clumsy, transparent lie. His meetings never started before 9. It was barely 7. "Julian," I started, taking a step toward him. "About last night. I gotta go," he cut me off, grabbing his bag from the floor. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, like a cornered animal seeking an escape route. He wouldn't look at me. He was already at the door, his hand on the knob. "Jules, wait," I pleaded, my heart sinking into a cold, dark pit. He paused, his back still to me. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, the words directed at the door. "I shouldn't have. It was a mistake," and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden, crushing silence of the apartment. I stood there, frozen, staring at the closed door. A mistake. The word ricocheted around my skull. The most honest moment of my life, a moment that had felt like a revelation, was a mistake. The hope that had bloomed so tentatively in the dark was crushed, stomped out by the harsh, unforgiving light of morning. I walked over to the coffee mug he had left for me. It was cold. The silence that followed was absolute. He didn't text. He didn't call. My phone, which had once been a lifeline to him, became a source of constant, low-grade torture. Every notification that wasn't from him was a tiny disappointment. Every time it remained silent, it was a confirmation of my own foolishness. I had misread everything. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of a simple, drunken, lonely gesture. He had been vulnerable, and I had taken advantage of it. Or worse, he had kissed me, regretted it, and was now so horrified by his own actions, by what it might mean, that he couldn't even face me. Friday came. I cleaned the apartment, bought takeout from our favorite place, and sat on the couch, pretending it was just another Friday. I told myself he would show up. He would knock on the door, and we would talk, and we would figure it out. But 9 o'clock came and went. Then 10. Then midnight. The food grew cold on the coffee table. The silence in the apartment was no longer comforting. It was mocking. He wasn't coming. The ritual was broken. Our friendship was broken. I had traded the steady, reliable ache of unrequited love for this sharp, catastrophic pain of rejection. I had lost him. A second week passed in the same agonizing silence. I couldn't work. I couldn't sleep. I walked through my days in a gray fog of misery. The man who lived for light and shadow was now trapped in a colorless world. I developed the photos from the weeks before, the images of abandoned factories and decaying storefronts. They looked like self-portraits. empty, hollowed out, haunted by the ghost of what used to be. The anger began to curdle the sadness. How could he do this? How could he share something so intimate, so vulnerable, and then just disappear? How could he leave me alone with the wreckage? I couldn't live in the ruins. I couldn't live with the not knowing. The ambiguity that I had once found so intoxicating was now an unbearable poison. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. On the 15th day of his silence, I made a decision. I put on my jacket, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment. I was going to his. I was going to force the confrontation he was so desperately trying to avoid. Our friendship was already dead, I told myself. What more did I have to lose? His apartment was in one of those new, soulless glass towers that had sprouted up downtown. The lobby was sterile and smelled of lemon-scented cleaner. I gave my name to the concierge, who eyed me with suspicion before buzzing him. I fully expected him to refuse the call, to tell the concierge he wasn't home. But after a long pause, the elevator doors chimed open for me. The hallway on his floor was silent and carpeted, swallowing the sound of my footsteps. I stood outside his door, my heart pounding. My anger had evaporated, replaced by a raw, terrifying nervousness. I raised my hand to knock, but the door swung open before my knuckles could make contact. He stood there, looking worse than I had ever seen him. He was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, not mine, but his own. His hair was a wreck, and he had the dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days. His pristine, minimalist apartment was a disaster zone. Takeout containers were piled on the counter. Clothes were strewn over the designer furniture. He looked like a man under siege. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his expression a mixture of dread and a faint, heartbreaking relief. He stepped back, a silent invitation to enter the wreckage. I walked in, and he closed the door behind me. The click of the lock sounded final. "What happened, Jules?" I asked, my voice quiet, devoid of accusation. I was too tired for anger. I just needed to understand. "Just talk to me." He wouldn't look at me. He walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city and stared out at the view. He had a view that spanned for miles, but he seemed trapped in the four corners of that room. "I freaked out," he said, his voice flat. "I'm sorry, I gathered that," I said, a hint of my frustration leaking through. "But why? What did I do wrong?" "You did nothing wrong," he said, turning from the window to finally face me. His eyes were filled with a desperate, frantic confusion. "It was me. It's all me. Leo, I don't know what's happening. I've spent my entire life on a track. You know? There was a plan. College, soccer, job, girlfriend, marriage. It was all laid out. A straight line." He paced the room, his hands running through his hair, his movements agitated. "And then, I don't know. It all started to feel fake. The job, the apartment, even Amelia. It was like I was playing a part. The only place it felt real was at your apartment. On your couch. With you." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his gaze unflinching for the first time. "I felt safe with you. It was the only place I could just stop. Stop performing. Stop pretending. And I thought that's all it was. I thought I just needed my friend." He took a shaky breath. "But that night, when I asked if I could kiss you, it wasn't because I was drunk or lonely. It was because it was the only thing in the world I wanted to do. And it felt right. It felt more real than anything has in years. And that terrified me, because it's not on the map. It's not part of the plan. I've never felt that for a man before. I didn't know what to do with it. So I ran. I ran because I was scared of what it meant about me. And I ran because I was scared of hurting you, of messing up the one real thing I had left." He finished his confession, breathless, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked like he had just run a marathon. He had laid it all bare. His fear, his confusion, his shame. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting himself. The anger I had been nursing for 2 weeks dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had stumbled off his own map and was completely, terrifyingly lost. I closed the distance between us. I didn't say anything. I just stood in front of him and waited. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for something. Forgiveness? Absolution? An instruction manual? I didn't have any of those things. All I had was the truth. Jules, I said, my voice soft but firm. I've been in love with you for 10 years. The confession dropped into the silent room like a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread across his face. Shock, disbelief, and then something else. A slow, dawning comprehension. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were reevaluating every moment of our shared history, every late-night study session, every movie night, every shared silence, seeing it all now through this new, clarifying lens. What? He whispered, the word full of awe and a kind of dawning regret. 10 years. I nodded. Since the championship game. The goal. I saw you, and I just knew. He sank onto the edge of his expensive, uncomfortable sofa, his head in his hands. Oh my God, he murmured into his palms. I'm such an idiot. All this time, I had no idea. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. All those girlfriends, all my whining. Leo, I am so sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for, I said, sitting down next to him, finally closing the last few inches of that vast, cold distance that had separated us. You didn't know? I never told you. I was too scared of losing you, just like I was, he said, a look of bitter irony on his face. We're a pair, aren't we? Two cowards, maybe, I said. Or maybe we just needed to get lost together to find the way. We talked for hours. We dismantled the past, examined it piece by piece, and then began the slow, careful work of building something new. He told me about the suffocating pressure he'd felt his whole life to be a certain kind of man. I told him about the loneliness of living behind a camera, of always observing and never participating. We were two halves of a whole, each possessing the part the other was missing. He was the action, I was the reflection. He was the kinetic energy, I was the quiet gravity. We had been orbiting each other for a decade, and we had finally, clumsily, collided. There was no magic fix. No sudden, cinematic kiss that solved everything. It was awkward and messy and uncertain. But it was honest. For the first time, everything was on the table. There were no more secrets, no more unspoken rituals, no more plausible deniability. When I finally left his apartment late that night, he walked me to the door. So what now? He asked, his voice small, vulnerable. Now, I said, reaching out and taking his hand, my fingers lacing through his. It felt both strange and perfectly natural. You stop running. And I stop waiting. He squeezed my hand, a silent promise. Friday, he asked. I smiled, a real, unburdened smile. Friday, the first few weeks of our new beginning were a study in tentative grace. We were like two people learning a new language, fumbling with the grammar of a shared life, translating the familiar vocabulary of friendship into the new syntax of love. The Friday night ritual was resurrected, but it was different. It was intentional. He didn't come to my apartment to collapse. He came to connect. The exhaustion was still there, a product of his demanding job, but it was no longer the central character in our story. We talked more. We looked at each other more. The couch was no longer a space of careful neutrality. It was a place where he would lean his head on my shoulder, not out of fatigue, but as a simple, open gesture of affection. Sharing the bed was the biggest change. There was no more pretense of being too tired to go home. He just stayed. The first time, after that long talk at his apartment, was filled with a gentle, nervous formality. We lay on our opposite sides, the chasm reinstated. But this time, the silence was not about fear, it was about respect. It was about giving each other the space to adjust to this new reality. In the middle of the night, I felt him stir. I braced myself for the familiar, unconscious drift. Instead, his voice, quiet and clear in the darkness. Leo, I'm here. Is it okay if I move closer? The question, the simple, respectful asking for permission, unlocked something in my chest. Yeah, Jules, I whispered back. It's okay. He moved slowly, deliberately, until his chest was pressed against my back. He wrapped an arm around my waist, his hand coming to rest on my stomach. It was the same position he had found so many times in his sleep, but this was different. This was a choice. This was conscious. I covered his hand with my own, our fingers intertwining. And for the first time in 10 years, I slept soundly with him beside me. We began to build a life in the small moments. In the mornings, we'd make coffee together, bumping into each other in my small kitchen, a clumsy but happy dance. He started leaving things at my apartment: a toothbrush, a change of clothes, his favorite running shoes. My home, once my solitary fortress, began to feel like our shared territory. He saw the blurry photograph, the one from the championship game, which I kept tucked away in a book. He pulled it out one day, his expression unreadable. "This was it, huh?" he asked softly, tracing the outline of his younger self with his finger. "This was the moment, that was the moment," I confirmed. He looked from the photograph to me, his eyes filled with a decade of unspoken history. "Can I keep it?" he asked. "It's always been yours," I replied. My photography began to change. I had spent years finding beauty in emptiness, in decay, in the things people left behind. Now, I found myself drawn to life. I started taking portraits again, something I hadn't done in years. My favorite subject, of course, was him. I didn't take pictures of him sleeping anymore. That felt like a violation now, a relic of a time when I could only love him as a secret. Instead, I photographed him awake. I photographed him laughing as he tried to cook, his face dusted with flour. I photographed him reading on the couch, the morning light catching the gold in his hair. I photographed him looking directly at me, his eyes clear and open and full of a quiet, steady love that still, after all this time, took my breath away. The man who had once been a secret I kept from the world and from myself had become my truth. One evening, months later, we were lying on the couch, his head in my lap, just as it had been on that first, terrifying night. But everything was different. My hand was not frozen, it was stroking his hair. My breathing was not ragged, it was calm and even, synchronized with his. He was not unconscious, he was just resting, his eyes closed, a small, contented smile on his lips. The lavender and rain scent was still there, but it was no longer the smell of anxiety and fear. It was the smell of home. He opened his eyes and looked up at me, his gaze so direct, so full of love, that it felt like the most profound statement in the world. He didn't need to say anything. We had moved beyond the need for constant verbal reassurance. We had learned to speak the quiet language of touch, of presence, of shared space. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. In the quiet of the evening, with his head resting in my lap, I understood that some moments in life don't just change the future. They redeem the past. They take all the lonely, silent years of waiting and transform them, not into a waste, but into the long, patient, necessary journey it took to finally arrive right here.